This video is sponsored by Game Toppers. Turn your own kitchen or dining room table into a premium portable game solution at a fraction of the cost. Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 776. Today we're going to take a look at a game called Corrupt Bargain, the 1824 presidential election. It's from Decision Games, designed by Alex Berry. I believe this is his second game design. I reviewed a game of his 7 or 8 years ago called High Treason, the Trial of Louis Riel. I think I got that right, which was kind of a political trial situation. And this one is kind of a multiplayer presidential election, which usually is like a two-player game. You know, if you think of 1960 and some other presidential election games, usually, you know, one Democrat versus Republican kind of thing. This is actually a 2 to 4 player game. And there's a nice little history sort of chunk in the rule book in the back, but it was very much like a very chaotic kind of election. I don't want to get into the details here because you can get kind of lost in the details and kind of the vying for power within the different party structures, and you know how the one party was kind of disappearing at the time and all that kind of stuff. Well, now what effectively this is sort of an El Grande style area control game, but definitely with some kind of flavor around the edges to kind of make it, you know, sort of political and election idea. So you're trying to get different numbers of electoral college votes like we have today in the United States, but it works significantly different back during these times here. So let's jump down to the table, show you how it works. Actually a very simple and straightforward game. And then we'll come back and tell you my thoughts. Okay, here I've got kind of the game set up, and you can see it's basically the eastern half of what was known as the United States today. We hadn't fully kind of explored all the different territory and acquired it, but you have some different sections. You've got the west here, which is the brown area, the south, which are these handful of purple states, and you've got a whole mess of states up here in the north, these kind of green states, but some of them are so small, and you'll be placing cubes and other pieces in there that they are broken out here in their own kind of places on the side here. So you got Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and so on. And then a couple down here, which we would probably call the North today, but back then Delaware and Maryland there are in the South. And so effectively what you're trying to do to win the game is get to 131 electoral votes. And you do that by a couple different ways. By getting cubes out here, these are representative of your popular votes, your population, or getting these octagons out here, and these are considered like politicians or political power and that kind of thing. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is everybody has a set number of pieces. So we'll just scroll down there. So you have a set number of politicians and cubes, and you have those in the different player colors there. And the general rule for placing these is that you can place these politician octagons in any space, but you can only place the popular cubes, the population cubes, in the spaces here with the square. You can see these have these Capitol buildings in these spots, and only the politicians matter there, because back then those states didn't award their electoral college votes based on the internal popular vote within the state. It was kind of like backroom deals with different state legislatures. So you're going to play the game over a course of a number of different rounds, and you can see here we have the round track. So if you're playing a 4-player game, you're going to play 10 rounds. 3-player game, 13 rounds, and so on. And so at the end of those rounds, you're going to do all those rounds, and then you'll have what's kind of like called a final push round, which is kind of like a big sort of end game round, which I'll show you. After that, you'll total up the electoral college votes. If somebody hits 131, then they're just going to be the outright winner. If nobody hits 131, then you're going to eliminate the last place person. So if you're playing a 4-player game, you'll eliminate the last place person, and then you'll kind of recalculate those votes, but only based on the politicians within each state. And then it's whoever wins 13 states, which would give them the majority of states, would win. And then if those don't win, then you can break it down. There's a whole bunch of different like tiebreakers that could come into play there. So effectively, before I tell you the mechanics, the interesting thing is that you really win the game with the popular votes, but you're sort of ceding the sort of political influence out on the board for the somewhat, not always inevitable, you know, busted election that's going to then break down to the contingent election. And I'll talk through some of the tiebreakers here. So there's a couple of ways to start the game. You could start the game with an empty board like so. There's also what's called like the historical setup, and they'll have different players put different sort of cubes and octagons in there seated out on the board, and you'll effectively take the role of one of the 4 primary politicians at the time: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, or Andrew Jackson. And then based on, and I think this is the player order actually on here, so then the start player will get those states, second, third, and fourth, and you will kind of seed some stuff out on the board and then actually start on the second round of play. I've played it both ways. I kind of like the historical sort of quick setup. It kind of eats up that first round of play, gets everybody kind of positioned, then you can kind of pivot from there and you have some information to go on. So the way that the game works is there's 3 decks of cards. Okay, we have the event deck here, which you can see. Then we have the populace and politician cards, which you can imagine match the populace and politician cubes. What you're going to do on your turn is you're going to take one of these event cards. Now you can see here from this point of view, the writing's a little small, but it's nice because they have these indications of which state is going to be affected based on kind of the picture there. So you have an idea of what's going on. And it's a little hard to read at first, but once you kind of get the hang of it, it's not a big deal. So you'll choose one of the cards, and then you'll just do what it says on the card. And then you'll see each of these cards is in a different slot. So you've got 0 action points, 1 action point, 1 action point plus insight, 2 action points, 2 action points insight, and 3 action points. And when you take this card, let's say we take this Illinois one here. So we take a look here, we'll say, we took this card, a couple things to notice. Here you have the suit. There's 3 sort of issues at the time. There's slavery, economy, and then like shipping or something like that. I can't remember. To me, they're just symbols. So you're kind of looking to have 3 of a kind of a suit, which I'll explain. And then you have the event here, which says place 2 populace cubes and 2 politician cubes in Illinois. And then you can see the spot that you took it will give you 2 action points. So as you sort of take cards, let's say I took this one, this will slide down, new ones will come out, and then these cards will get more and more powerful in terms of the amount of action points that they award you. So it's kind of a balancing out between, well, the event's maybe, not so great for me, it's okay, but then as the card gets down further, you get more action points. So you always take the card, do the event, keep this card in your hand for the suit for later, which I'll talk about, and then do the actions. And the game has a nice player aid. There's 4 of them, so everybody's got it. You've got your sequence of play. It breaks down how to do the election. It's all really straightforward on this side. And then on the other side, it shows you the different actions you can do. So there's 5 different actions plus the insight, which I'll talk about. And depending on how many action points you can get, you can do any of these actions. You can only do the action once. So if you get 2 action points, you can't do campaign for political support twice. You've got to do that once and then some other time. So the actions are all really, really simple. First action you can do is you can take and put one of your octagons wherever you want, anywhere on the board. Second action you can do is you can take one of popular vote, put that anywhere on the board, except of course, any of these places with a Capitol building, couldn't put it there. The other 2 actions that you can do is to draw cards from either the populace deck or the politician deck. And what you do is you always draw 4 cards off this deck. You'll take a look at one of these, keep it, and then put the other 4 back on the bottom of the deck. So you can, for one action, either do the populace deck or the politician deck. You are going to keep these cards for that final push turn, which I'll talk about. But you can see these will affect, so I grabbed these from the populace deck. These all will manipulate population cubes. The politician deck will always manipulate those politician octagons. So these will be kind of like little surprises or things that you can kind of do at the last second, which I'll talk about. Now the last action you can do is called the political intrigue action. So any spot where you have 2 or more politicians, you can remove one of your politicians and then remove up to 2 of an opponent's politicians. So that's simple. Political intrigue, remove one of yours, you can remove 2 of somebody else's. So after you've taken your event, done any actions, if you chose a space here that has insight, then you will do that last. And the way that that works is you will target a player, they will shuffle up all of their populace and politician cards and then hand you 2 randomly. You will take and look at both of them and keep one of them. So it's a way to steal kind of one of the last kind of final push events, and then it gives you kind of an idea of what they're kind of looking for. So you get some insight into their hand that they're starting to build. So like I said, you keep doing that, going around and around until you get to the final turn. You'll play the final turn, and then you'll have a final push. But before we talk about final push, I'm going to talk a little bit about turn order. It works slightly differently, and the rules give you a nice way to kind of track this. So let's say we're playing a 3-player game, and what will happen is, let's say we start the game, we're here at round 2, red is the first player. We're going to go around the table, blue, and then yellow. So all 3 players have had a turn. We're going to skip red. Now the second player of the previous turn was blue, so we'll mark them here. So then blue will go, and then yellow, and then red, and then we're going to skip blue. So the first place player always goes last on the following turn, and it tells you just to use one of these markers to kind of keep track of that, and that works really, really well. And that does add a really interesting kind of turn order dynamic to the game, and it kind of helps, I think, balance this row here. So, you know, it's not always kind of favoring that early turn order player to always grab like a good card with a good amount of action points. So it kind of helps mix that up a little bit there. So that's how that turn order works during the majority of the game. When you get down here to the final turn, then you're going to go into the final push, which I'll show you. Now there's one other thing I'm going to show you before we talk about the final push, which I just remembered I should have talked about. Remember I talked about how we would collect suits. So if you have 3 of a suit, so if I have 3 of this icon here, or 3 of this icon, there's 3 different suits. The first thing I can do on my turn before picking one of these event cards and doing the actions is I can play and discard 3 of a kind. Let's see, I'll just grab these 3 here. I'll play 3 of a kind there and discard those out of the game. And then I can play one of these lockdown markers here, and I can put these on any state that I want. Probably, zooming over here, a state that I'm winning, and maybe probably one that I'm not winning by a lot. So if I put this in here, what that means is no event or action or card play or anything for the rest of the game can add or remove tokens from that particular spot. And that does get important because there are certain event cards that will ask you to remove some of your own, and you can't, of course, go remove them from a place that you've locked down because you've locked it down. And that would just give you a free space to remove it. So you've got to remove it from somewhere that you haven't locked down. So that it does get kind of interesting there with how that works. So nothing can change that state from the entire rest of the game during the final push or any point at all. So that's the other part that you can do for your turn when you play kind of 3 of a kind of these cards. So that's another thing you're also trying to look for in terms of, you know, the action points and the events is also the suit. Because that lockdown can be huge, especially if you lock down, you know, one of these bigger states up north like so. So once we get down here to the final turn, then we're going to look at whoever has the most total populace and politician cards. And then you're just going to start playing them one at a time, and you just play them, and then I'll play the next one, then Billy will play one, and then back to you, and so on. Now when you play these, let's say you play it and there's nowhere to put a cube because maybe all the states in the south are either locked down or they're one of these places that has you know, a Capitol building and the cubes can't even go in there. So you just play that with no effect. So effectively passing, which isn't the end of the world because then you're kind of seeing what everybody else does and then it'll get back to you. And then you just keep going around and around the table. If somebody invariably will have more cards than the other players, they'll just play through their cards one at a time. And then we'll go through here and total up the popular votes in each of the states. And the game does give you this handy little deck of cards here, which I've organized by southern states, western states, southern states, and the northern states here. And then so you just work through the states, say who won that one, give them this card, give the other one this card, and you hand out the cards, and then everybody is able to total up their points pretty easily. One thing to note is New York has a first and second. That's the only state like that. So first place will get 24 votes, second place will get 12. So again, you total those up, and then whoever has, 131 electoral votes will be the winner. If not, then you go to the contingent elections and so on. Now, there's one thing to note here is you say, why would I ever really put politicians in these states? Because we don't count the politicians. We only count the popular votes. Well, if you're tied, let's see if I can set up a tie here real quick. So 3 of those in there. Let's say we had 3 of those. And then, let's throw a politician in there. So at this point, we're going to look and see, okay, it's 3-3, 3 popular votes, 3 popular votes, but yellow has the tiebreaker with politicians. Oh, well, what if we're tied on politicians? Then we're going to look at the region, and this is not realistic, but let's say this was like this. The most politicians in the region would be yellow because he's got a third one up there in Kentucky. That would break the tie. If that's a tie, then you look at the whole board and look at all the politicians there. If that's a tie, then you will flip, each player will flip the event card deck, and then we will look at the number at the bottom Whoever has the higher number wins, because that's how close that election was. I've not seen that where you get all the way down to the election. Usually it's broken, definitely by the time you get to the whole board. So that goes for kind of like everything. So when you start doing the contingent elections, it breaks down that way. Most politicians in the region, most politicians on the board, and then flip the event card if you're still tied. But that is pretty much the gist of the game. Okay, so that is Corrupt Bargain. We'll go through my 3 pillars of review. I've only played it at 2 and 3 players. Haven't had a chance to play it at 4 player. Definitely 3 players was the way to go. In terms of those 2 player counts, I think 4 player would be equal to the 3 player count, if not better, because I think just that many more sort of considerations at the table. Would probably have a lot more tiebreakers, a lot more sort of spread out, just kind of watering down of the vote, if you will, which I think would be a little bit more interesting. But with the 3 player, you still have that. The 2 player, you don't really have it so much. I thought it was okay at 2 player. It was fine, but to me, this is a 3 and 4 player game. I really enjoyed it at 3 player, kind of not trying to bury the lead here, but 3 player was really good. I would like to try it at 4 player. The play time, the box says 60 to 90 minutes. I mean, I think 90 minutes tops. Maybe a 4 player game would go 90 minutes, because once everybody knows the game, I think you could easily do 4 player in about 60, because it's pretty straightforward. Once you kind of get the lay of the cards, like I said, they're kind of, the writing is a little small, but has that nice picture of the region. So you go, okay, this is going to mess with stuff here or here or here, and that's kind of where I want to be. I need to kind of shore up my votes over on the west or whatever. You can kind of easily indicate, and you can go look exactly, okay, well, it's at 4 things here or 3 things here. That's not usually that pertinent. You just know you need to go to that spot. And sometimes there's, there might be some differences. And then you can easily tell where the action point is and stuff like that. So it's going to be easy to get in after your first play, figure out how things are. And then you kind of also, the other thing that you need to know is like, this seems obvious to say, like, where are the big states? Because those are the ones that you need to definitely try to get, like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, stuff like that. Because that's what's going to get you closer and closer to victory. But also, it has this kind of neat, and so we're going to move into like what this game is like, and I'll just throw a game out there that has not been published for years. It's actually a Martin Wallace game called Liberté, which was about the French Revolution. And the way that you sort of put influence in that, and you have this kind of cascading tiebreakers, and you were trying to maybe play for some of those tiebreakers, that's heavily present in this game. And I really, really like that, because it helps with the kind of, I don't know, like brute force area control that you can kind of get, where you're trying to sort of lie in wait. And you're like, okay, if I can just prevent somebody from the master main victory and set myself up to win that second victory, hopefully in a way that is not supremely obvious to everybody, then that's going to be kind of your best strategy to do that. Because you don't have to just kind of go for all the best states. You just got to win 1 or 2 of them, set yourself up to then win majority of more states after that, even though they might be smaller states. So there's an interesting kind of dynamic there with that. And that to me it really plays nothing like Liberté, but it kind of does. Because it has a very different feel, because Liberté was like a card-driven game. You had a deck of cards, you drew them, and you played to certain areas. Kind of like a combat or card-driven game like Twilight Struggle. Had that kind of multiplayer Twilight Struggle kind of thing. And this has that kind of feel, but instead of just drawing kind of randomly from a deck, from those event cards, you have them kind of laid out. So everybody's kind of always kind of drafting them. And it has that dual purpose event action point thing going on, which you see in a lot of the more recent CDGs over the last 20 years. And I like that aspect of it. So it feels like kind of a different take on a CDG, and kind of like a multiplayer CDG, where you can kind of going for the event. The event's something that you can always do, but are you picking the card more for the event? Are you picking it more for the action points? Are you picking it more for the suit for later? So you're kind of weighing all that. And I've seen where it seems like early in the game, everybody's kind of picking those big action point ones, because you can go anywhere. So okay, the board's still pretty wide open, And so those 3 action point ones are always selected. But as things start to get locked down, as the game sort of progresses, people start to effectively lock down places because they have such a majority. It's like, why would I go there and compete? Then the action points become a little less important, but maybe some of the events become more important, even though and I've seen players choose a 0 action point event because they're like, well, this is going to allow me to do a lot of stuff over here, and that's where I want to go. I don't get to do anything extra, but the event's good enough. So that's a cool, interesting balance there. And then you move into the final push, which everybody has that kind of like the little secrets, they're kind of laying in wait, trying to manipulate certain stuff. And that's interesting. I think the most interesting part about that is actually the insight, because when you not so much taking a card, which is important, but just seeing which cards they chose. Because when you draw the politician card or the populist card, you draw 4, and you're picking one of those. So if somebody is kind of picking strategically, then you go, oh, they seem to be picking up a lot of the North cards because there's a lot of small states in the North, for example. Or they're thinking, oh, maybe I could snag 1 or 2 of those at the end. So you kind of just process that in there. But they could also be, I had this discussion yesterday, they could also just be picking random stuff to kind of throw you off, like on purpose picking random stuff, because they're not really trying, they're trying to throw you off and think that they're going somewhere else when they're going this other way. And that way they have also like a breadth of possibilities in the final push. And that's something you also don't want to ignore as part of one of your actions, as opposed to just putting the cubes and things out there, because having that sort of being able to play at the end of the game and have those kind of, momentum shifting kind of cards to come into play, that's also really cool and really important. Now, I will say with the whole drawing cards out of that deck, and then also the insight where you get to kind of look and steal, that will kind of slow the game down. But the easy way to play around that is unless you chose insight, once you start to choose either the politician deck or the populist deck action, the other player can start going. That's how we started playing it. It's just like, okay, so for my last action, I'm going to draw from the politician deck. Okay, good. So now I can start looking at the event and doing this. And then by the time everybody's kind of like figured out what they're going to do, things have not really done anything to the board state that's going to alter any choices, and it keeps the game moving along really quickly. And the comments have always been after I've played this game of like, wow, this is like pretty meaty and stuff, but it plays super quick. It's kind of have that perfect balance of like, it's pretty meaty and it's only about an hour. So I think the game does a really good achievement with that. And anyway, that's kind of a way to alleviate. Now the insight thing, that is something else. But it doesn't seem to happen too much. It's not like constant insight, because it's not worth doing insight until people have a lot of cards to pick from. Because if you do it at the beginning, they may have 1 card, or something. And at the end of the game, it doesn't matter because people's heads are full. So if it slows the game down like 10, 20 seconds, it's not a big deal. Because when I first read that, I was like, that's going to kind of really bog the game down. But it doesn't in practice, I don't think, because it doesn't really happen towards the end of the game, and then people are still kind of really scratching their heads over what is in that event row anyway. That, okay, yeah, fine, you guys do your insight thing, I'm still looking at these cards. So it works out really well that way. So yeah, I really like this game. It is got a lot of really cool elements, like I talked about, Liberté, some sort of pseudo CDG type of elements, that kind of multi-tiered or multi-layered area control, where you're kind of looking at the areas in multiple ways in terms of controlling, the popular vote versus the politicians and versus the different regions and that kind of thing, and trying to hit those tiebreakers, because those tiebreakers will certainly come up. I mean, especially when we have played at 3 players, and I expect it even more in a 4-player game, where it's going to be really crunchy. So maybe it would hit up to that 90 minutes, because there's just going to be a lot more ties happening. And that was one of the great things about Liberté, was like you had to watch those, you had to look for those to see kind of what the cascade effect is. And this game has a lot of that same stuff in here. And I like sort of the political sort of, it's a pretty streamlined, efficient, elegant design, but it does kind of wiggle in some of those thematic elements where you kind of, backroom dealing with drawing the cards and looking at those and getting the suits together, and the lockdown dynamic there just adds like it's so simple thing. It's just, there's some suits and you lock it down and it just will sort of pivot the game state, and everybody's like, oh wow, now we've got to kind of react to that. And you can see where people are trying to go to lockdown, and it has another little kind of emergent quality of like, you want to lock down something you're barely winning. Because if you've got, like, let's say New York is one where you've got, like, let's say you got 7 politician cubes in there and nobody else has any. There's no reason to lock that down. Like, let them come and fight for that, get second place or whatever, or you've got another big state. There's no reason to lock that down. So you're trying to lock down the ones that are tight. So that little dynamic there adds a lot to the game. So anyway, I definitely recommend this. I think it came out last year and is like in more readily available copies earlier this year. So definitely take a look at this one. Corrupt Bargain. Thanks.